Well, remember that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the G7, had a similar experience to President Ramaphosa in his capacity as both the South African President and, of course, the G20 President. They both had meetings in the Oval Office, and they both, managed to navigate those meetings with deft political acumen, if one wants to quote some of the analysis post that discussion. And so you saw what a bilateral meeting between two heads of state or heads of government is supposed to look like. Cordial in front of the cameras, and then you get into the intractable issues behind closed doors. What you saw at the White House was, a public display of ventilating issues of concern that really should have been discussed behind closed doors. And so you saw a warmth there between the presidents of the G20, the president of the G7, and a mutual respect there. Does Canada and South Africa agree on everything? Certainly not, right? One of the sticking points between South Africa and a number of the Western nations gathered in Canada will be how to end the escalation you're seeing in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. South Africa has questioned Israel's assertion of its right to self-defense, the anticipatory nature of the invocation of Article 51 in terms of the UN Charter, which affords countries the right to self-defense. South Africa raising questions about whether there was an imminent threat here from Iran. Of course, this all stems from the IAEA report that said Iran had enriched uranium up to a point where it could fuel some 10 nuclear bombs, but the timeline for that remains unclear, given that Israel immediately the day after that report struck at Iran's military and nuclear sites. So yes, a very warm welcome there from the Canadian Prime Minister, a warm welcome that he extended to President Trump, who is also there. I can tell you the Secretary General of the United Nations is also en route there. But there are many intractable issues to be discussed at that meeting. There are questions around economic growth and the stability of the global economy based on the unilateral actions of the United States. There are concerns around energy security, and that will be one of the topics that President Ramaphosa will take part in tomorrow in terms of the outreach element of the Leaders Summit in Canada. And then, of course, the geopolitical concerns, right? When you talk about the economy in Paul, one has to arrest some of the military divisions you are seeing playing itself out around the world, because then those economic benefits cannot then filter down to places that are at war with each other, and a great deal of concern not only in the Middle East, but also in wars in Africa, Sudan in the main, Eastern DRC, which we know very well, and of course that long-standing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky also expected in Canada over the next 2 days.
Now, what's to be made of reports of US President Donald Trump's intentions to not sign the G7 statement related to Israel and Iran?
Well, the G7 presidency has already indicated that there will not be a joint communique, which is the custom at the end of these multilateral engagements, be that the G20, be that meetings at the United Nations in New York, or the G7, right? And so they are saying, we don't expect there to be agreement on everything, and that's kind of how these joint communications come to pass. So there is already an indication that there won't be consensus on everything, particularly as it relates to Ukraine, particularly as it relates to the Israeli-Iranian conflict. President Trump, we understand reports coming out of the G7 meeting today, refusing to sign on to a joint statement that would call for de-escalation between Iran and Israel. Yes, it's a statement that also asserts Israel's right to self-defense here, but the president reluctant to sign on to that joint communique that would call for de-escalation. And what message does that send? He believes that Israel is winning the war against Iran. What we do understand now is that Israel has air dominance over Tehran and Iran writ large. It is striking sites at will. And of course Iran responding with ballistic missiles. But what we do know to be true is that Israel's intelligence here has been quite superior to that of the Iranian government. Yeah. And of course you've also heard statements from the likes of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who told ABC News that he would not rule out taking out the supreme leader of Iran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, among the strikes that have decapitated a number of senior leaders within the Iranian government, within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the armed forces. So superior intelligence, Israel has dominance over the skies. This is a very tenuous moment for the Iranian government, and I think President Trump, by not signing on to that agreement, probably knows a little bit more than we do in that regard.
So when the G7's been described as a small elite club, why is it so significant to think about who will be in the room as important decisions are made, more so as you reflect the time of global turmoil and this new radical approach by the US to world affairs?
It used to be this elite club of the richest, most progressive and developed democracies in the world. You'll recall that between 2014, Russia was a part of what was then the G8. You now have the EU as a sort of regular member, so it is kind of still a G8, but it's you have the G7 plus the EU now. And of course, you heard in that meeting between President Trump and Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, President Trump expressing some regret that Russia was excluded from the G8 at the time, that then became the G7 after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so, to your question, though, this sort of wealthy elite club, there's a recognition within the G7 that they have been seen this way around the world. And what you've seen over the last decade, certainly over the last decade, is invites extended to other leaders around the world that are not party to the G7. So you've had President Ramaphosa, for example, invited in various capacities. In this instance, as the G20 president, India's Prime Minister will be there at this meeting, the Australian Prime Minister. We understand the Indonesian government head of state has been invited, and various other leaders, including President Lula of Brazil, we understand, has also been invited. And so there is a recognition that the G7 needs to engage with other leaders around the world, and I think that's an argument that really buttresses the reason President Ramaphosa is in Canada at this time, because everyone now looks to the G20 as perhaps a little bit more representative of what the world, a multipolar world, looks like, as opposed to this Western elite club that in itself is finding out various limitations, right? The lack of consensus being one of them, given that the United States has taken a very strident posture in terms of how it asserts itself around the world. There is a different posture as it relates to the Middle East. There is a different posture as it relates to the war in Ukraine, and there's certainly a different posture as it relates to economic relations, even with former U.S. close allies, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and the like, all within the Trump vortex. And so there's a broader recognition here that expanding these conversations to include others outside of the G7 becomes important in terms of the veracity and the impact that the decisions and the communiques that they do manage to agree on around that table today. It becomes more viable if you have more people in the room supporting those initiatives.
Absolutely.
It's not every day that a world leader gets the cold shoulder from one superpower and then a warm embrace from another, especially within the same month. But that's exactly what happened to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. One moment, he's being grilled in the White House by Donald Trump, facing pointed questions about white Afrikaner refugees. The next, he's standing on Canadian soil, smiling alongside Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, receiving what can only be described as a diplomatic bear hug at the G7 summit in Calgary. Now, that contrast isn't just interesting, it's revealing. And the message it sends to the world, that depends on who's reading between the lines. Let's rewind the tape a little. In May, President Donald Trump stunned political analysts and reignited global controversy when he accused South Africa of orchestrating, or at the very least tolerating, a so-called genocide against white Afrikaners. He claimed the US had quietly accepted more than 60 of them as refugees, a shocking and highly controversial move. South Africa denied the allegations. Ramaphosa, as you might expect, didn't take kindly to the insinuation. The White House meeting that followed was nothing short of icy. Ramaphosa was clearly there to do damage control, but the mood was tense, the press conference brief, and the body language unmistakable. Fast forward to the G7 summit in Calgary. A different tone altogether. Ramaphosa stepped onto the global stage once again, but this time greeted with open arms. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau praised South Africa's role in climate leadership, regional peacekeeping, and economic cooperation. The body language was relaxed. Smiles were genuine, and both leaders even shared a light moment on stage, caught on camera, as if to underline just how far removed this was from Washington's frosty reception. So why does this matter? Why should we care that one leader was friendly and the other confrontational? Because this is more than just optics. It reflects deeper geopolitical dynamics that could shape South Africa's position in global affairs for years to come. Let's start with the Trump angle. The former US president has always played a different game when it comes to diplomacy: unpredictable, personal, and unapologetically brash. His statement about Afrikaner genocide wasn't just controversial, it was also politically calculated. Trump has a strong support base that resonates with themes of white victimhood and Christian persecution. By spotlighting white South Africans, he wasn't just making a humanitarian appeal, he was also tossing red meat to his political base. The decision to accept Afrikaners as refugees wasn't born from consensus within the US State Department. It was a Trump call, one that's already stirring debate inside US immigration policy circles. And what about South Africa? The country flat out rejected Trump's claims, calling them dangerous misinformation. The government argued that while crime in the country is a serious problem, it does not amount to genocide. But even among South Africans, the debate is complex. Some Afrikaner communities have voiced concerns about targeted violence, while others insist they are being used as political pawns in an international game of chess. The issue isn't black and white, no pun intended. But when the most powerful man in the world labels it genocide, the rest of the world pays attention, whether it's true or not. That's where Trudeau's warm welcome takes on new meaning. Canada's approach couldn't be more different. By rolling out the red carpet for Ramaphosa, Trudeau signaled that Canada still views South Africa as a key partner, not a pariah. This isn't just about correcting an awkward narrative, it's about strategic alliances. Canada wants to deepen ties with African nations, especially those seen as relatively stable and democratic. South Africa, despite its many problems, still wears that badge. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The optics of Calgary were about more than just friendship, they were about trust. And that trust could translate into new trade agreements, energy cooperation, and even shared environmental goals. Canada's booming green tech sector has been eyeing African markets, and South Africa, with its mix of first-world infrastructure and third-world challenges, is a prime testing ground. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the fallout from Trump's refugee move is still rippling through political channels. Human rights organizations are questioning the fairness of prioritizing white Afrikaners over African and Middle Eastern asylum seekers who often flee war, famine, and ethnic cleansing. Critics argue that Trump's actions set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that not all refugees are equal, and that politics, not need, determines who gets in. But here's the twist. Ramaphosa, for all the criticism he gets at home for rising unemployment and power cuts, may have played this whole situation with remarkable finesse. He didn't lash out publicly at Trump. He didn't cancel the White House meeting. Instead, he kept it diplomatic. And now, less than a month later, he's being treated like a statesman in Canada, rubbing shoulders with leaders of the world's richest economies. That's not a bad recovery. So what does this say about the future of South Africa on the world stage? A lot, actually. The country is walking a tightrope, balancing relationships with Western democracies, navigating growing economic ties with China and Russia, and trying to maintain its own democratic credibility amid mounting internal problems. How it handles this moment could determine whether it sinks into international isolation or rises as a voice for the global South. And let's not ignore the domestic implications. For South Africans watching from home, this sudden shift from diplomatic frost to warmth might inspire a mixed bag of emotions. On one hand, it's a proud moment, a reminder that the world still cares what South Africa thinks. On the other, it's a bit of a wake-up call. Because if international leaders are talking more about your problems than your solutions, then it's time to take a hard look inward. The media coverage in Canada focused on shared values and common goals, but make no mistake, behind the smiles and handshakes, there are high-stakes negotiations happening. Climate partnerships, energy security, economic stimulus. Ramaphosa may not have had an easy time in Washington, but he seems to have landed on his feet in Calgary. In the end, The contrast between Trump and Trudeau isn't just a tale of two personalities, it's a snapshot of the international crossroads South Africa now faces. One path leads to isolation and suspicion, the other to opportunity and collaboration. The choice, as always, lies in what South Africa does next. And whether the warmth of Canada's welcome can help thaw the challenges still looming back home.